Originally, the worries that China brought for the international trading system, the rules-based trading system that we worried about maybe beginning a decade or so ago, were its system of subsidies, state-owned enterprises, industrial policy, its 5-year plans. Its economy was just fundamentally different from ours, and the rules didn't seem to work in providing the right buffers and interface that we needed to engage properly with the Chinese economy. So that was a long known concern. But I think more recently there's become an even bigger challenge with China. And I think this was, at least for me, best captured in President Xi Jinping's speech, now famous speech that he gave in 2020, his dual circulation speech, where he said out loud, he envisioned a trading system for China to be engaged in that would be one in which China was not going to be dependent on the rest of the world for any of its supply chains or what it needed, but he wanted the rest of the world to be very dependent on China for our needs, right? The United States, UK, Europe, Japan. So that was his articulation, right? And when you think about it, you say, wow, a rules-based system requires a willingness to be interdependent with each other. I will export to you, you'll export to me. We'll have some frictions, but we'll work it out. This was China viewing the world of, no, we're not going to have interdependence. We're going to have one-way dependence, where you're going to be dependent on us and we're not going to be dependent on you. And then you look at the data and it starts to seem as if not only are these their goals, but they're achieving their goals, right? First, it's market share targets that they laid out in the Made in China 2025 industrial policy for lots of high-tech goods, whether it's batteries, electric vehicles, semiconductors, things of that nature. But it's also in the macroeconomic data. China's exports are booming to the world, even though they've basically now been shut out of the US market, but they're not importing from anyone. And then finally, you saw, as they made clear last year in 2025, they were also going to weaponize these one-way dependencies and cut off other countries from essential inputs. So when they shut down exports of rare earths and permanent magnets and Nexperia, mature node semiconductors that nearly shut down the auto industry of the Western economies worldwide, that made clear to everybody, wow, we have become way too dependent on China for these essential inputs. That is the trade war that we have to fight right now to extract ourselves from being able to be coerced from China. The China challenge is affecting the entire world, right, at the moment. And so at the high end, we're now seeing it directly impact, the juggernauts of European manufacturing, right? So high-end German automakers, machine tools, right? The strengths of the European industrial base for decades are now under threat. But as you said, at the same time that China's moving at the high end into more advanced manufacturing that's traditionally been dominated by high-income countries, it's not vacating, the more labor-intensive ends, right? The paths to economic development that have been there for, generations now. My colleague at the Peterson Institute, Arvind Subramanian, has a new piece of research that's out that's just exactly on this point, right? That it's actually amazing how China is not vacating the production of clothing or shoes or toys, right? The pathway for development that would expect it to be next up for Africa, say sub-Saharan Africa. It's just not leaving that, right? And that's a real challenge that those countries face in terms of their own paths, looking ahead for economic development.
For anyone listening, Chad's done a great interview with Arvind actually on Trade Talk, so I'd suggest check that out, and we'll try and put a link to that podcast and Arvind's paper in the notes. Just on that point, you mentioned sub-Saharan Africa. I'll just bring this back to our home audience here a little bit, because we had Nigel Pusey on, who runs Container Trade Statistics, sort of the best volume figures for goods trade by ship. Sub-Saharan African container imports were up 33% in the first quarter. That's like a million extra containers, or more or less. Almost all of it from China. But it's not just sub-Saharan Africa. Central and South America were up 17%. He thinks that China made a deliberate pivot to the global south in late 2024 to get ahead of US tariffs. How does that flood of cargo fit your idea of the China squeeze?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen that, right? And so I think, again, another miscalculation on the American side was thinking that China was just hugely dependent on the US market for its exports of consumer products. And we've seen that to not be the case, right? Since, all the tariffs went on beginning in 2018, 2019. China's exports to the rest of the world have continued to boom, right? Originally it was Europe, and now Europe is at the front lines, and they're trying to figure out, do I impose, export restrictions and new rules to try to limit the damage that's being caused to, our industrial base. And when they do, well, then the next question is, well, where else are these things going to go? If it's not the United States, if it's not Europe, it's oftentimes going to be into other emerging markets. Now, the challenge is, right, it depends on what the product mix there is. So it's going to be, there could be huge benefits, right? So if China wants to export a lot of solar panels, for example, to sub-Saharan Africa in ways that can be utilized to help those countries build out their, infrastructure and electrical grid, that would, and help deal with climate change concerns at the same time, that would be hugely positive. I think it's going to be much more difficult if you're talking about high-end electric vehicles, right? Because the complementary, needs there is you need to have the the electrification in the first place. You also need to have the charging infrastructure, right, in a concentrated place to be able to recharge those vehicles, which, as we've seen in the United States, is part of what's held back the adoption of EVs here too. So anyway, it depends, I think, on the products as to how effective the strategy for China will be over the long term in terms of seeing markets like sub-Saharan Africa as viable for its sort of excess manufacturing that's no longer being able to be shipped to either the United States or Europe.